What's up guys, my name is Mark. A lot of you have been requesting for me to make a video explaining how the NBA salary cap works. What is a soft cap? What's the luxury tax? What are mid-level exceptions? Now there's a chance that you already know what some of these terms mean, but there's also a chance that you've seen some of these words used in articles and you don't know exactly what it means. So in today's video, I will cover all the basic terminology you need to know as an NBA fan and how all of these different things interact with each other. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive description of NBA economics or NBA salary cap. This video is entitled Everything You Could Know. It's everything you need to know. However, my promise to you is that by the end of this video, you will know more about the NBA salary cap than the majority of NBA fans. Now, before we get into the video, I want to give a quick shout out to SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. You might be getting tired of hearing SeatGeek by now since they pop up all over the place, but hey, that's for a good reason. SeatGeek is by far the best way to get tickets to sporting events, to concerts. It's an app that you can download right to your phone and it has a ton of cool features. You can preview the seats you're buying before you actually buy them. It allows you to compare prices from different ticket selling websites so you can know when or when not you're getting the best deal possible. And the app is just super user friendly. And if that sounds interesting to you, you can use my promo code MDJ, that's MDJ, for $20 off of your first purchase. And links to the app, to the SeatGeek app, will be down in the description below. Alright, now on to the video. Starting off with some very basic terminology. Salary cap. What is a salary cap? In sports, a salary cap is a restriction placed upon teams as to how much money they can spend. So what's the point of having a salary cap? Well, the main reason we have a salary cap in the NBA is to maintain fair competition. If we didn't have a salary cap, big market teams that have a lot of money, say the Los Angeles Lakers or the New York Knicks, could just outbid all these small market teams for free agents, and they could just stack up superstars. Now, big market teams still have an advantage in the NBA, but the advantage is a lot smaller than it would be if we didn't put restrictions on how much money teams could spend. There are two main types of salary caps. We have what people call hard caps and soft caps. A hard cap is an absolute limit on a team's payroll spending. Think of it as an unbreakable law. Under no circumstance are you ever allowed to spend more than the hard cap allows. On the other hand, a soft cap is, well, it's softer. It's still a cap, but there are some exceptions where you can spend more than the soft cap. In the NBA, there technically isn't a hard cap. There's no absolute salary number upon which teams absolutely cannot exceed. We do, however, have a soft cap, and even though teams regularly spend more than the soft cap allows, we have systems in place that punish teams for going over that soft cap. The more you exceed that salary cap, the more punishment and limitations there are. So while we don't technically have a hard cap, the increasing punishments make it practically impossible to exceed the soft cap by too wide of a margin. One of these punishments for going over the soft cap is the luxury tax. The luxury tax is a certain amount of money that teams have to pay if they spend more money than the tax line. Now, the tax line and the soft cap aren't exactly the same thing, but they're close. The tax line is usually a little bit higher than the soft cap. For the 2017-18 season, the soft cap is set at $99 million, while the tax line is set at $119 million. The amount of luxury tax you pay is proportional to how much you exceed the tax line, but like we said, it proportionally goes up the more you exceed it. If you're exceeding the tax line by less than $5 million, then you pay $1.50 in tax for every $1 you exceed in team payroll. However, if you exceed the tax line by more than $20 million, then you pay $3.75 in tax for every $1 you exceed the tax line. Teams are also punished if they are repeat offenders, meaning that if they have exceeded the tax line in at least 3 of the previous 4 seasons, then they have to pay even more if they wish to stay above the tax line. All these rules are meant to discourage teams from spending too much money, and for the most part, they work. Even the richest owners in the NBA don't like the feeling of paying nearly $100 million in luxury tax So now you might be wondering, if teams only pay taxes when they go above the tax line, then what's the point of the salary cap? While you don't pay taxes for being above the salary cap but below the tax line, you do suffer from additional restrictions. To give an example, let's say a team, entering free agency, has already committed $79 million to the players they have. This team has $20 million of money to spend on players in whatever fashion they wish to do so. After they spent that $20 million and then they hit the salary cap, they're no longer allowed to sign any players, since that will leave them above the salary cap. They also can't make a trade that puts them above the salary cap, unless they use an exception to the rule. Let's take a look at some of these exceptions. The most common exception is the minimum salary exception. The idea is pretty simple. Let's say a team spends all of its $99 million on just 5 players. They're no longer allowed to sign players, technically, since that would put them above the cap, but they obviously need more than just 5 players on the team. The minimum salary exception allows a team to sign as many extra players as they want, provided that each player is signed for the minimum salary and for a contract no longer than 2 years. Another common exception that teams use to get above the salary cap is the Larry Bird exception. The Larry Bird exception allows teams to re-sign the players they currently have, even if it puts them above the salary cap. In this exception, the team has the bird rights to a certain player. Not every player has bird rights, and you can't use the Larry Bird exception on every player you have because there are a couple of qualifications, one of them being that you have to play 3 years in a row without ever being waived. There are also other variations to the Larry Bird exception, such as the non-bird exception and the early bird exception, which all have different qualifications, but they all do the same general thing, which is to allow a team to keep a player even if it means going above the cap. Another exception you might have heard of before is the mid-level exception. The mid-level exception is granted to every team every year, and it's a relatively small amount of money that teams are allowed to use to sign players, regardless of whether or not they're above the cap. In this past NBA season, most teams had a mid-level exception of $8.4 million, and they were allowed to divide up this $8.4 million in whichever manner they wished to do so. They can use this pool of money on just one player or 3 different players. For example, the Pelicans divided up their mid-level exceptions amongst Rajon Rondo, Darius Miller, and Frank Jackson, so they had about $2.1 million left over. However, the $8.4 million was only granted to non-taxpayers. For taxpayers, that is people who went above the tax line, mid-level exception was less. In this case, around $5.2 million. The Thunder, for example, were a tax-paying team in 2017, so they only had $5.2 million in mid-level exception money, and they used all of that to sign Patrick Patterson for exactly that amount. There are other exceptions that are available to NBA teams for signing players beyond the salary cap. Minimum salary, bird, and mid-level are just the most common. Let's move on to how individual contracts with players work. We've all heard of the concept of max contract before, a player that is offered the maximum amount of money in a given contract. There's only a couple of interesting details about max contracts, so I'll talk about them here. The max contract is a percent. When players sign a max contract, they are signing based on a percentage of the total cap space, which means that it fluctuates as the cap space itself fluctuates year from year. Why is it that throughout NBA history, the cap space has changed year after year, sometimes in small increments, other times in huge increments? The answer is that cap space depends on the amount of income the NBA generates. Usually the trend is upward as the NBA becomes more and more popular around the world, but we have seen some minor setbacks during recent years. Back to max contracts. The percentage of total cap space that determines the max is also different based on how many years a player has played in the NBA. If a player has played less than 6 years, then that player can earn at most 25% of the total cap space. But that number jumps to 35% for veterans who have played 10 plus years. This is why a max contract given to a player coming off of his rookie contract, such as Bradley Beal, to take a recent example, is substantially less than a max contract given to a veteran such as Steph Curry. There are some exceptions to this rule, one of them being the Derrick Rose rule, which allows a player who has played less than 6 years to earn 30% of the cap space instead of the standard 25% if he meets one of 3 following qualifications. Either you get voted into 2 All-Star games, or be named to an All-NBA team twice, or be named MVP. Blake Griffin and Paul George are 2 players who have taken advantage of this rule after it was adopted in 2011. And finally, the last important detail about max contracts is the designated player extension, which might sound fancy, but you probably already know how it works. This is the exception that allows a team to re-sign their own players to a 5-year contract, whereas other teams are only allowed to offer 4-year contracts. This rule is again created so that there is an incentive for a player to stay with one franchise as opposed to bouncing around the league from team to team. And the logic here is pretty simple. NBA fans generally don't like seeing their beloved players go to other teams. Usually it's not good for business when a superstar player who's played his whole career for a certain team decides to go somewhere else. Moving on, I'll now briefly explain the 2 different types of free agents: the restricted free agent and the unrestricted free agent. An unrestricted free agent is what it sounds like, unrestricted. He is allowed to sign with any team he chooses. The restricted free agent, however, is not free to sign with whatever team he wants to. The restricted free agent can talk to different teams and negotiate contracts with them, but once that restricted free agent has agreed to a contract with another team, his former team has the right to match that contract and keep the player. The current rule is that a team has up to 2 days to match the offer. If they choose not to match, the restricted free agent then successfully signs with the other team. We've recently seen this happen with Otto Porter in 2017, when the Brooklyn Nets offered him a max contract and the Washington Wizards matched their offer. Finally, to wrap things up, everything we've talked about in this video, all these fancy rules and systems and exceptions, are all written into the Collective Bargaining Agreement, or the CBA for short. It is called the Collective Bargaining Agreement because it's a contract between the league and the Players Association. Typically, the CBA lasts for about 7 years long, and when the CBA expires, a new one has to be agreed upon. And every time, both sides take advantage of this opportunity to change the CBA. For example, the Derrick Rose rule we talked about was written into the new CBA after the old one expired in 2011. Sometimes negotiations can stall and can cause a lockout, where the NBA can't begin playing games because their agreement hasn't been made. We saw this in 2011 as the back and forth negotiations caused the season to start very late, thus teams only playing 66 games that year as opposed to 82. But other times, things go much more smoothly like they did in 2017. Our current CBA doesn't expire until 2024, so the rules described in this video are guaranteed to remain consistent for at least the next 5 years. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a thumbs up. I'm actually going to judge the feedback I get from this video to see maybe if I want to make another video on the NBA salary cap. But anyways, thank you for watching. If you're an NBA fan and you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. I'll see you in the next video.